Before we get started, there are a few pieces of software that need to be installed. This is not a big deal, except for Linux where it gets a little more involved. But Microsoft provides step-by-step instructions, so you end up copying and pasting from the documentation to the terminal. It's pretty easy. The first thing you want is the .NET Core SDK itself. This can be found at the .NET homepage with the URL .net, and this will redirect to microsoft.com/net. Now if you install Visual Studio on Windows or macOS, you'll get .NET Core automatically. On Linux, you'll need to install it yourself, and you can also install it without Visual Studio on Windows and macOS. Notice the most recent version, as of the time of this recording, is 2.1. If you're watching this video in the future, and things don't look quite right on your machine, it could be a version conflict. Generally, there are not too many changes between minor versions, although the move from 2.0 to 2.1 did reveal some breaking changes. Make sure to get the .NET Core SDK and not the .NET Framework SDK. The .NET Framework is Windows only, and also the APIs are different. It won't even work on macOS or Linux. Instead, the .NET Core SDK will run across platforms. Also, there are two download options, one for building apps and one for running apps. We want the first one. The SDK gives us the developer tools, while the runtime only allows us to run apps. With the SDK installed, you'll have access to a command line tool named .NET, and we'll see it a lot in this course. Now command lines differ a little on Windows versus macOS or Linux. In order to bring some of the commands used on macOS and Linux to Windows, I'm going to install a special piece of software that comes along when you install Git, which is the source code control system. This piece of software, called the bash shell, is very similar to the shell that is used on macOS and Linux. This kills two birds with one stone, since Git is strongly recommended. The last piece of software is the editor, and I'll be using Visual Studio Code. This is a lightweight text editor that is inspired by Visual Studio, but works across Windows, macOS, and Linux. To get Visual Studio Code, visit code.visualstudio.com. I've got everything installed on this machine, so I don't need to do anything else, plus watching installs is rather boring. Instead, I'll show you how to configure Visual Studio Code the way that I'll be using it. I've got Visual Studio Code pinned to my taskbar, so I'll click on the icon to open it. The first thing I want to do is set up the integrated terminal. Again, I'm going to be using a number of command line applications, as Visual Studio Code doesn't rely upon GUI wizards to configure projects. Visual Studio Code provides an integrated terminal for this reason. To access it, I'll press Control backtick on the keyboard. By default, on Windows, this will likely be PowerShell. However, I want to use Git Bash, which was installed with Git. To do this, I'll press Ctrl-Shift-P to bring up the command palette. The shortcut for the command palette on the Mac is Command-Shift-B, but what I'm doing right now is Windows only. I'll search for the command terminal, select default shell. It's actually at the top of my machine because I've used it recently. This command will give me a list of the shells installed on my machine. So here's PowerShell, the default Windows command prompt, and the bash shell, which was installed with Git. Now when I open a new terminal, it will use the Git bash shell. Finally, I need to install an extension that will add debugging and editing features to Visual Studio Code to help with developing .NET Core applications. To get it, I'll click on the extensions icon in the sidebar. Then, I'll search for the C# extension. This first one by Microsoft here is the one that I want. I'll click the Install button, and after a few seconds, I'll be prompted to reload or restart Visual Studio Code. When Visual Studio Code restarts, the installation will be complete. And that's all for the setup, at least for now. In the next video, we'll look at how to use the .NET command to create a .NET Core application. Thanks for watching.